The desert had its own kind of silence, not empty, but alive. It whispered through the sagebrush, hummed against the rocks, and breathed through the cracks of old wooden doors. On nights like this, when the wind moaned and the clouds rolled low over the sand, you could almost believe the desert was alive, and watching. Mary Dalton knew that silence better than anyone. For 3 years she'd lived alone in her late husband's cabin, on the far edge of the Arizona Territory, a place too far for company, too dry for crops, and too forgotten for law or gossip. She'd grown used to the rhythm of solitude, the creak of the porch, the hiss of the kettle, the long conversations she had only with herself and the wind. That night, the wind had teeth. The storm was moving in from the south, heavy with thunder and dust. Rain was rare in these parts, but when it came angry. The sky flickered with white veins, and the thunder rumbled deep enough to shake the floorboards. Mary set another log on the fire, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The air smelled of smoke and sage, and a strange, metallic taste hung in the wind, like change. Then came the sound that didn't belong. A knock. Soft at first, then again, louder, urgent, 3 raps that cut through the roar of the storm. Mary froze. Her hand stopped halfway to the kettle. She stared at the door, her heart drumming. No one came out here. Not in the middle of the night. Not in this kind of weather. Another knock, this time a man's voice, strained and low. "Ma'am, please." The voice was faint, roughened by pain or dust or both. Mary's instinct said danger, but something in that voice, desperation, pushed against her fear. She lifted the rifle from beside the hearth, the same one her husband used to carry. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the door. The firelight behind her threw a long, thin shadow across the floorboards. "Who's there?" she called out. No answer, only the wind. Then again, a thud, like a body collapsing against the door. Mary's breath caught. She hesitated only a heartbeat before unbolting the latch and pulling the door open. Lightning split the sky. A man stood there, half fallen against the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, soaked in rain and streaked with blood. His hat was gone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He clutched his side with one gloved hand, the other braced against the doorway to keep from collapsing completely. "Please," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "Just a place to rest." Mary's eyes took in the torn coat, the mud-caked boots, the blood seeping between his fingers. She could see the holster at his belt, empty. A gunman, maybe, or worse, but the storm howled behind him, and the look in his eyes, tired, pleading, left no room for cruelty. "Come in," she said softly. He staggered through the doorway, nearly collapsing as the wind slammed the door shut behind him. Mary grabbed his arm, guiding him toward the hearth. His weight was heavy, but she managed to lower him onto the rug near the fire. "Thank you," he rasped, eyes fluttering shut. She could see now how pale he was, his skin ashen beneath the dirt. The blood on his side was thick and dark. "Don't thank me yet," she muttered, fetching a basin of water. "You might not live till morning." He gave a weak, crooked smile. Wouldn't be the first time someone said that. Mary knelt beside him, cutting open his torn shirt with a pair of shears. The wound was bad, a gunshot, by the look of it, torn through the ribs and half clotted. She'd seen enough in her time to know it wasn't fresh. 2 days old, maybe. Festered by travel and heat. "What happened to you?" she asked, cleaning the wound. "Wrong place, wrong men," he murmured. "You a lawman?" He shook his head faintly. "Outlaw, then." His lips twitched. "Depends who you ask." Mary didn't press further. She worked silently, washing the blood away, wrapping the wound tight with linen. The rain beat against the windows, and the fire cast the only light between them. When she was done, she leaned back, studying him. He looked younger now that the dirt was gone, maybe mid-30s. A man used to hard miles and harder choices. Scars crossed his forearm like pale lightning. His hands were calloused, his nails black with dust. There was something about him, danger, yes, but something else too. Sadness. "Name?" she asked finally. "Elias," he said. "Elias Crow." She nodded slowly. "I'm Mary Dalton." The storm outside deepened, rumbling across the horizon. For a moment neither spoke. The fire cracked, and the sound of rain against the glass filled the silence between them. "You shouldn't have opened that door," Elias murmured after a while, eyes still half closed. "Why's that?" "Sometimes trouble knocks real polite." Mary gave a dry smile. And sometimes it just needs a place to rest. He looked at her then, really looked. In the flicker of the firelight, her features softened, the lines of loss around her eyes, the quiet strength in her jaw. Not beautiful in the way of city women, but real, like weathered wood and desert flowers. Elias's eyelids grew heavy. I'll be gone by sunrise, he whispered. Mary shook her head. Not in that condition, you won't. He didn't answer. Sleep took him before she could argue. She sat there for a long time after, watching the storm rage beyond the window. In the firelight, the stranger's face looked almost peaceful, though she could see the tension in his jaw, the ghosts that followed him even into sleep. Outside, thunder rolled over the desert. Inside, two lives, a lonely widow and a wounded drifter, had just crossed paths in a way neither could have expected. And somewhere in that dark, wild night, the desert itself seemed to breathe, as if it knew what had begun. The frontier had its own rhythm, one that was harsh, unrelenting, yet quietly mesmerizing. Snow melted into rivulets that ran across the plains, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint aroma of pine from distant ridges. The days lengthened, bringing sunlight that was at once blinding and golden, stretching across the grasslands in waves of warmth that belied the chill still lingering in the shade. For Lieutenant James Harrow, life at the outpost remained a blend of routine and vigilance, punctuated by patrols across the sprawling wilderness and the occasional clash with nature, or the occasional threat that lingered in the distance like a shadow he could neither touch nor see. He had become accustomed to the solitude, yet solitude had a weight, a kind of silence that pressed against the soul. It was during these long hours, wandering the ridge paths with only the wind as company, that he would think of Eleanor Merrick. Her letters had become a lifeline, a bridge across the vast emptiness, a soft illumination in a world often colored by gray frost and muted sunsets. The second letter he received from her arrived one morning, delivered with the usual bureaucratic delay, crumpled slightly at the corners. She wrote of the small changes at home, the bloom of early daffodils in her garden, the arrival of spring birds with feathers glistening in the sun, the small acts of kindness she had witnessed in the town square. Eleanor spoke of her nights spent reading aloud, her voice filling empty rooms, as though trying to make them resonate with life once more. Harrow read her letter aloud to himself by the fire, savoring every word. He felt as though he could almost hear her voice, tender and precise, hovering in the quiet of his hut. It was a strange comfort, this imagined presence of someone he had never met. The letters themselves became rituals. He would polish his writing desk, light the lantern, and take hours to compose his replies, each word chosen with care, each sentence a reflection of both the frontier and the delicate, living thread that connected him to her. He began to write not only about the monotony of duty but also about the subtle beauties and small dangers of life at the outpost. He described the patrols along icy ridges, the distant silhouettes of wolves that sometimes stalked the edge of their territory, the crackle of the fire at night, and the rare moments when the men would sing old songs, their voices carrying across the plains like echoes of home. In each description, Eleanor's presence was implicit, as though she were standing beside him, sharing in every sensation, feeling every chill and every fleeting warmth of the frontier. In her replies, Eleanor often mirrored this intimacy. She wrote of letters received from neighbors, of small festivals in her town, of music she had discovered, and books that had captured her imagination. She included passages from novels, poems she had loved, and stories of her own childhood memories with Thomas. Sometimes, she confessed small fears, the worry that James might be too far away, that the frontier could take him, that the letters might be all that survived should something unforeseen occur. Yet there was also courage in her words, a desire to understand, to connect, and to share her life with him, even across the distance. Weeks became months. Harrow's patrols became longer and more taxing as the seasons shifted. He would rise before dawn, donning layers of wool, leather, and fur, and trek across snow-drained plains or through marshy lowlands where the mud threatened to swallow his boots. The wind was a constant companion, cutting through him with unrelenting force, yet he endured it with a steadfastness fueled not only by duty but by the promise of Eleanor's letters. There were nights when the cold pressed through his hut walls so completely that sleep was a distant memory. He would sit by the fire, staring into the dancing flames, penning letters with meticulous care, tracing each curve of his handwriting as though the act itself could bridge the miles. He poured his thoughts into the letters, the exhilaration of discovering animal tracks in the snow, the terror during skirmishes with wandering bandits, the loneliness of watching sunsets alone, and the quiet triumph of surviving another day. In one particularly long letter, Harrow described a patrol along the northern ridge where he had encountered a herd of elk. He detailed their movements, the way the sunlight caught the dew on their antlers, the soft sound of their hooves on frozen ground. Eleanor's reply, when it came, was filled with wonder, as though she were standing beside him, marveling at the scene through his eyes. She wrote of her own moments of observation, flowers blooming too early, the gentle fall of rain, the small joys she found in a world that often seemed confining. Through these exchanges, an unspoken intimacy grew. They shared fears and hopes, silent dreams, and fragments of their souls. Harrow found that he could tell her things he could not confide in his fellow soldiers, his doubts, his memories of Thomas, the small regrets he carried in the corners of his heart. Eleanor responded with understanding and empathy, creating a space in her letters where honesty and vulnerability were safe, where emotion could flow freely without judgment. Winter faded entirely, leaving behind fertile plains and rushing rivers. Harrow's patrols extended into territories previously unexplored, and the solitude became almost sacred. He would walk for hours along ridges, imagining Eleanor reading the letters he sent, imagining her thoughts and reactions, imagining the conversation that existed silently between them through ink and paper. The frontier had become a canvas upon which they painted a shared world, a world that existed in letters, in imagination, and in the quiet, unspoken bond that grew with every correspondence. Yet the solitude of the frontier was not without peril. During a particularly long patrol, Harrow's unit encountered a sudden blizzard, the wind howling through the ridges like a living entity intent on swallowing them whole. Visibility dropped to near zero, and each man struggled to keep his footing on the icy terrain. Harrow wrote to Eleanor later, describing the storm in vivid detail, the way the snow whipped across the plains, how state. In response, Eleanor wrote back with a mixture of concern and fascination, asking questions about his survival, expressing admiration for his endurance, and sharing small personal stories to distract him from the harshness he endured. Through every trial, the letters became more than communication. They were lifelines, tangible proof of connection, proof that despite the miles, the danger, and the isolation, human hearts could reach each other. Harrow realized that his sense of duty was no longer just toward the regiment or the outpost, it was toward this unseen, unwavering presence who awaited his words across the distance. By the end of the first year of their correspondence, the bond had solidified into something undeniable. Harrow had begun to think of Eleanor as more than a recipient of letters. She had become a mirror of his own emotions, a companion in the most profound sense, a presence that existed in every patrol, every quiet evening by the fire, every glance across the frozen plains. He found himself speaking to her aloud as he wrote, sometimes laughing at small absurdities of frontier life, sometimes whispering confessions he had never dared admit. Eleanor, in turn, confided her own fears and hopes with increasing candor. She spoke of her loneliness, her longing to see the world beyond her home, and the small victories that marked her days. She began to ask questions of him not as an outsider but as someone intimately invested in his life, questions about what he feared, what he hoped for, what he had never told another soul. It was during this period that Harrow came to understand the true depth of their connection. Letters, which had begun as a channel for grief, had transformed into something far more significant, a shared existence that transcended distance, danger, and time. Through words, they had created a world together, a world in which sorrow could be spoken, joy could be shared, and intimacy could flourish even in the most barren of landscapes. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the plains, Harrow sat by the fire with a letter freshly opened. Eleanor's words spoke of her day, the way sunlight had caught the morning dew on her garden, the quiet pleasure of reading a book aloud, the memory of Thomas that lingered in her mind. She wrote with care, with curiosity, with a gentle humor that made him smile despite the fatigue in his bones. He read her letter aloud, feeling the wind press against the walls of his hut, imagining her presence in every line. It was in moments like these that Harrow realized the frontier had become more than a place of isolation, it was a landscape upon which their souls had begun to meet. The mountains, the rivers, the endless plains were not merely obstacles or scenery, they were the canvas upon which their connection had been painted, letter by letter, word by word, across distance, time, and silence. And so, in the quiet solitude of the frontier, Lieutenant James Harrow discovered a truth that would shape the months and years to come. Human hearts, even when separated by unimaginable distances, could find each other, could speak, could share, could grow. Through the exchange of letters, through the careful articulation of thought and feeling, he had found a companion, a confidant, and a presence that gave life meaning in a world defined by its harshness and its silence. The desert had a strange way of keeping secrets. It buried bones, swallowed trails, and let men disappear without a whisper. But it never forgot. No matter how far you rode, your past always found a way to follow, like a shadow you couldn't outrun. By the fourth morning, Elias Crow was strong enough to saddle a horse. Or at least, he tried. Mary found him out by the corral, struggling to tighten the cinch on her husband's old mare. His shirt was half buttoned, the bandage beneath it stained dark again. The sun glinted off his hair, and for a moment, he looked like any other ranch hand, except for the weariness in his movements. "You planning to kill yourself on that horse?" she called from the porch. Elias turned, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Just trying to stretch my legs. You'll stretch them straight into a grave if you don't rest another day." He stopped, leaning one arm against the saddle horn, his breath catching slightly. "Can't stay, Mary. You said that yesterday, and the day before," he admitted. "But this time, I mean it." She folded her arms, watching him. "Running never fixed much, Elias." "Neither does waiting," he said quietly. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of mesquite. Mary looked at him, this man who'd appeared like a ghost out of the storm, and felt a strange ache stir beneath her ribs. She told herself it was only worry. But she knew better. "You won't make it far," she said finally. "Maybe not, but staying here puts you at risk. Those men I mentioned, they don't forgive easy." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If they find me here, they'll find you too. And I won't have that on my conscience." Mary met his gaze steadily. "You think I scare easy? I've buried a husband, Elias. The desert doesn't take me without a fight." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got more grit than most men I've known." She smiled faintly. "Then quit wasting it arguing with me. Go rest." He chuckled, defeated, and turned back toward the cabin. But something dark flickered in his eyes, a tension he couldn't shake. That night, the moon rose red over the mesa. Mary couldn't sleep. The wind had changed again, soft, but uneasy, like the desert was holding its breath. Elias was awake too, sitting by the fire, the old rifle across his knees. His expression was distant, listening for something only he could hear. "You expecting company?" she asked quietly. He looked up, startled. Then shook his head. "Just habit. Too many nights waiting for the wrong kind of knock." Mary crossed the room and poured 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, their fingers brushing, a small, electric moment that made them both pause. The air between them seemed to hum. "Tell me the truth," she said after a while. "Who are these men you're running from?" Elias hesitated, then sighed. "Used to ride with them. Years back. A gang out of Prescott. Called themselves the Delaney brothers, though they weren't kin by blood. Robbers, smugglers, killers, some of them. And you." "I was their tracker. Best shot in the group. Until I saw what they were capable of." His jaw tightened. "We hit a stagecoach outside Flagstaff. Thought it was carrying payroll. Turned out it was a family, a man, his wife, 2 kids. They didn't make it." Mary's hand froze around her cup. "My God, I walked away that night," he said softly. "Took a bullet for it, too. Thought I could outrun what I'd done. Guess the desert had other plans." The silence that followed was thick as the night outside. Mary looked at him, the pain in his eyes, the honesty, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, compassion. "You can't change what's behind you," she said quietly. "But you can decide what kind of man you are when the past comes calling." Elias looked up, searching her face. "And what if the past doesn't give me that choice?" Before she could answer, a sound cut through the quiet. Hoofbeats, faint at first, but growing louder. Steady, measured. Elias's head snapped toward the window. The coffee cup hit the table with a dull thud. Mary's pulse quickened. "Riders. 2, he said. "Maybe 3. He moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit desert. Dust trails shimmered in the distance, faint but real. "They found me." Without a word, Mary crossed to the wall and took down her husband's rifle. She checked the chamber, her movements calm but sharp. Elias turned toward her, surprise flickering in his eyes. You know how to use that. She gave him a hard look. I know how to protect what's mine. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two souls bound by something larger than fear. Then Elias said quietly, they'll be here before sunrise. The hours that followed stretched long and tense. Elias checked the window every few minutes, scanning the horizon. Mary prepared what little ammunition she had and doused the lanterns. The desert outside had gone eerily still, even the coyotes were silent. Sometime past midnight, Elias spoke again. If anything happens, you take the back trail behind the shed. It cuts toward the ridge. You'll be safe there. I'm not leaving you. Mary, I mean it, she said firmly. This is my home. I've lost enough without adding guilt to the list. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him softened. You're braver than most men I've known. Then stop treating me like I ain't one of them. He almost smiled, but the sound of hoofs shattered the quiet. They came from the ridge, two figures on horseback, dark against the silver of the moon. One carried a lantern that swung like a small, angry sun. The other dismounted, walking toward the porch with a heavy step. Elias raised his rifle slightly, eyes narrowing. Delaney, he muttered, didn't think he'd ride this far south. Mary crouched near the window, heart hammering. Through the glass, she could just make out the man's face, sharp features, a cruel mouth, eyes cold as river stone. The kind of man who'd kill for the pleasure of it. Crow, the man shouted, his voice carrying over the desert. You in there? Elias didn't answer. The man laughed. You always did have a taste for lost causes. Come on out, and maybe I'll let the lady keep her skin. Mary's stomach turned cold. Elias's jaw tightened, fury burning beneath his calm. Stay inside, he whispered. No matter what you hear. Before she could argue, he stepped out the door, rifle in hand. The wind caught his coat, the moonlight catching on the barrel. Delaney grinned from the foot of the porch. Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd bled out days ago. Disappointed? Elias asked. Not yet, but I aim to be satisfied. Two other riders emerged from the shadows, rifles gleaming. Mary held her breath behind the curtain, her finger hovering near the trigger of her own gun. Delaney took a slow step forward. You should have stayed dead, Crow. Would have saved us the ride. I tried, Elias said. Didn't take. Then, silence. The desert itself seemed to listen. When the first shot cracked, it sounded like thunder rolling across the sand. Mary fired before she could think, a burst of instinct and fear. The lantern shattered, plunging the scene into near darkness. Men shouted, hoofs screamed, and gunfire split the air. Sparks flew as bullets struck the porch rail. Elias dove behind the post, returning fire with quick, precise shots. One of Delaney's men dropped from his saddle. The other retreated behind a rock outcrop, yelling curses into the wind. Delaney himself ducked low, reloading. You think she can save you, Crow? He shouted. You'll bring her down with you. Elias's answer was another gunshot, close enough to clip the man's hat clean off. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell again. Only the wind moved, whispering through the brush. Mary crept to the door, heart still pounding. Elias, I'm here, he said, voice low. He's gone. For now. She stepped out, the air sharp and cold against her skin. Elias stood in the moonlight, his chest rising hard, smoke curling from his rifle. The body of one rider lay still near the fence. The others had fled, leaving tracks carved deep in the wet sand. Mary looked at him, at the blood on his sleeve, the wildness in his eyes, and something inside her broke open. Fear, relief, and something deeper tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart. You saved my life, she said softly. He shook his head. No, Mary, you saved mine, more than once. The night stretched long after that. They buried the dead man at dawn, beneath a lone mesquite tree at the edge of the property. Neither spoke much. Words felt small against the weight of what had happened. When it was done, Elias stood staring out at the desert, the same desert he'd been running through for years. This place, he said quietly. It's got a way of testing a man. Showing him who he really is. Mary glanced at him. And who are you, Elias Crow? He turned to her, the first light of morning catching his face. A man who's finally tired of running. She didn't answer, but the way she looked at him, steady, unflinching, said enough. The desert wind moved between them, carrying the scent of sunrise and dust. Something new had begun. Something neither of them could stop, nor quite name. The desert was silent that night, but not peaceful. The silence carried tension, the kind that hums in the air before a storm or a confession. Clara sat on the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The stars shimmered above like scattered shards of glass. From the barn, she could hear Elias moving, slow, deliberate, as if trying not to disturb the night itself. It had been a week since that night by the fire when their eyes had met too long, their words had gone too deep. Since then, something had shifted between them. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't just kindness anymore, it was yearning. A quiet understanding. Each morning, Clara would find Elias already outside, feeding the horses, fixing the fences, doing work that used to take her all day. His shoulder still ached, but he never complained. She brought him water and biscuits, and he'd thank her softly, his voice deep, gentle, careful. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours, yet it felt like they did. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with something neither dared to name. One evening, when the heat finally faded, Clara walked out to the barn to find Elias cleaning his old revolver. It was worn and dull, like it had seen too many battles. "You still carry that?" she asked quietly. Elias looked up, his eyes shadowed by the lantern's glow. "Habit," he said. "And maybe, fear." "Fear of what?" He paused, then said in a low voice, "That the past might ride up behind me one day." Clara didn't push. She could see the weight he carried, the kind only a man who's seen too much could bear. When she turned to leave, he said softly, "You shouldn't have to live out here alone, Clara." She froze. No one had spoken her name like that in years, gently, like it meant something. "I'm not alone anymore," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The storm inside. That night, sleep refused to come. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She could hear the faint creak of the barn door, the shuffle of Elias's boots. Every sound of him felt close, almost too close. Memories of her late husband drifted through her mind, how he had been kind at first, then distant, then gone, lost to the desert's cruel sun. She remembered the loneliness that had followed, the long nights of silence, the fear that she'd become invisible to the world. And now, here was this stranger, this wounded man, breathing life back into her days. When the wind picked up, rattling the windows, Clara got up and lit a candle. She hesitated at the door before walking toward the barn. The night air was cool, the kind that carried the scent of sage and sand. Elias looked up when she entered, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Could you?" she countered softly. He smiled faintly. "Not much." The silence that followed was tender, trembling. Clara's heart beat so loud she thought he could hear it. "Elias," she whispered, "what are you running from?" He sighed, staring at the floor. "A mistake. Maybe two. Maybe too many." She stepped closer. "You don't have to tell me everything. Just, don't lie to me." His eyes met hers then, blue-gray like a storm about to break. "I've never lied to you, Clara. Not once." Confession in candlelight. The barn was dim, the air thick with dust and the smell of hay. The candlelight trembled between them. Elias leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "There was a man," he began slowly. "A sheriff. He said I was guilty of something I didn't do. When I tried to prove my innocence, things went bad. There was a fight. A gun went off." Clara's breath caught. "You killed him." "I don't know," Elias said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to survive. But after that, there was no going back. They put a price on my head." She took a step closer. "So you're a fugitive." He looked up at her, eyes glistening. "I'm a man who made mistakes. Who's tired of running." Clara stood still for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I don't care who you were, Elias. I care who you are now." Her words hit him harder than a bullet. He reached for her hand, slow, uncertain. When his fingers brushed hers, it felt like touching sunlight after years in shadow. The kiss. The world seemed to hold its breath. The candle flickered. Outside, the coyotes howled somewhere in the dark. Clara didn't move away. She could feel his breath, warm and close. Elias searched her eyes as if asking permission without words. And then, they kissed. It wasn't the wild kiss of youth, but something deeper. The kind that comes from two broken souls finding something whole. When they parted, she stayed close, her forehead resting against his. "This is wrong," she whispered, but her voice had no conviction. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it feels like the only right thing I've known in years." Footsteps in the distance. Days passed. They worked side by side, spoke in glances more than words. But peace in the desert never lasted long. One afternoon, as Elias repaired the corral fence, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. Clara squinted. 2 riders were approaching fast. Her heart dropped. "Elias," she called, her voice sharp with fear. He looked up, saw the figures, and went pale. "They found me," he said quietly. Clara's breath hitched. "What do we do?" He stepped forward, calm but resolute. "You stay inside. Lock the door. No matter what happens. I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. Elias turned, his hand brushing her cheek. "You already saved me once. Don't let it cost you everything." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't fear, it was acceptance. The return of the past. The riders drew near, one wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the sunlight like fire. "Elias Monroe," the sheriff shouted. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory, you're under arrest." Elias stood tall, unarmed. "You don't want to do this, Sheriff." "Not here." Clara watched from the window, her hands trembling. The sheriff dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth. "You can come quiet, or we can end this right now." Elias's voice was steady. "You still think I killed your deputy, don't you?" "I don't think. I know," the sheriff snarled. Before Elias could reply, the other man raised his gun. Clara screamed. A shot rang out. The world spun into chaos. When the dust settled, Elias was still standing, but barely. The sheriff lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his gun kicked away. Elias's shoulder bled again, the old wound torn open. He stumbled back toward the porch where Clara ran to meet him. "Elias," she cried, catching him as he fell to his knees. He looked up at her, pain in his eyes but a faint smile on his lips. "Guess I wasn't done running after all," he said weakly. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You're not dying on me, Elias. Not now, not like this." He brushed her face with trembling fingers. "You make me wish I'd lived differently." Under the moonlight, that night, Clara sat by his side again, pressing cloth to his wound. The moonlight poured through the window, soft and silver. Elias spoke between shallow breaths. "If they take me, promise you'll forget me." She shook her head. "I can't. You have to." "No," she said, her voice fierce and shaking. "Because you didn't just knock on my door that night. You knocked on my heart. And I let you in." He smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Then maybe that's enough." Outside, the desert wind carried the echoes of what had been, 2 souls who had found each other at the edge of the world, bound by fate, torn by consequence. And as dawn crept over the horizon, Clara whispered a silent prayer. That somehow, somewhere, love might still be stronger than the past. The desert dawn rose slow and heavy that morning, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and gold. A new day had come, but for Elias Monroe and Clara Dawson, it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like the edge of an ending. Clara sat beside Elias on the porch, his head resting against her shoulder. The bandage around his chest was stained again, dark and wet, but he didn't complain. He watched the horizon, calm, quiet, almost peaceful. The sheriff and his deputy had ridden off before sunrise, leaving a promise to return with reinforcements. They had taken their wounded and left Clara's land behind, but not the threat. Elias's time was running out, one way or another. A fading light. "Do you think they'll come back?" Clara asked softly. Elias gave a faint smile. "A lawman always finishes what he starts." He turned to look at her. "But maybe not today." Clara pressed her hand over his, her fingers trembling. "You need a doctor, Elias. There's one in Dry Creek. I can hitch the wagon and take you." He shook his head. "You wouldn't make it. And even if you did, the sheriff would be waiting. I can't risk that for you. But I can't just," her voice broke. "I can't just sit here and watch you die." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a long moment, the world fell silent. "Clara," he said gently, "you've already saved me. Don't you see? You gave me something I thought I'd lost a long time ago, a reason to stop running." Her eyes shimmered. "Don't talk like that. I have to." he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Because the sun's coming up, and I don't know if I'll see it again tomorrow. The letter. When Elias drifted into sleep, Clara went inside and sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten alone for years, where she had prayed to no one in particular. She pulled out a piece of parchment and began to write, her hand shaking. Greater than to whom it may concern. His name is Elias Monroe. He is not the man you think he is. He saved lives, not took them. He's been punished enough by the ghosts that follow him. If you have any mercy left in your hearts, let him rest in peace. Sincerely, Clara Dawson. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her dress pocket. If the sheriff came back, she'd make them read it, even if it cost her everything. The stranger's story. By afternoon, Elias had woken again. His face was pale, lips cracked, but his eyes still burned with the fire of a man who refused to surrender. He asked for water, and when she handed him the cup, he caught her wrist and said, "There's something I never told you." "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted softly. "You deserve to know who it was that knocked on your door that night." Clara sat beside him, silent. "I wasn't always a wanted man," Elias began. "I worked cattle near Silver Ridge. Then one winter, a gang raided our ranch. They took everything, my friends, my horse, my name. When I went to the sheriff for help, he called me a liar. Said I was one of them." His voice hardened. "So I ran. Spent years trying to prove I wasn't the monster they made me out to be. But the truth is, the more you run, the more you start believing you deserve the chase." Clara listened quietly, tears running down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never see kindness again," he said. "Then I saw your light that night, shining through the storm like a sign from heaven. I almost turned back, but something told me, if I knocked, maybe this time, someone would answer." She reached for his hand. "And I did." He smiled faintly. "You did. The return of the sheriff. The peace didn't last long. By late afternoon, a rumble of hooves echoed in the distance, a low, steady thunder that grew louder with every second. Clara stood from the porch, shading her eyes against the sun. Dust rose on the horizon. 3 riders. The sheriff had returned. Elias struggled to stand, but Clara pushed him gently back down. "No," she whispered. "Let me talk to them." "Clara, you've fought enough, Elias. Let me do this." He hesitated, then nodded. "If it comes to it, don't let them take me alive." She froze. "Don't you dare say that." He gave her a weak smile. "Some men don't belong in cages." The stand. Clara stepped out into the sunlight as the sheriff and his men rode up. The wind whipped at her hair and dress, but she stood firm. "Afternoon, ma'am," the sheriff called. His tone was polite, but his hand rested near his gun. "You know harboring a fugitive's a hanging offense." "I know what he's accused of," Clara said, her voice strong. "And I know he's not guilty." The sheriff dismounted, scowling. "Ma'am, I don't mean to disrespect you, but that man shot my deputy." "Your deputy shot first," Clara snapped. "You saw it." The sheriff hesitated, jaw tightening. The deputy behind him shifted uncomfortably. "Step aside," the sheriff said finally. "We'll take him in." "No," she said, her chin lifted. "You'll take him when he's dead, and that blood will be on your hands, not mine." For a moment, the sheriff just stared at her. There was something in her eyes that unsettled him, not defiance, but faith. Then Elias's voice rang out from behind her. "Sheriff." They turned. Elias stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame, pale and bleeding but unbroken. "Let her be," he said. "This isn't her fight." "Elias Monroe," the sheriff said, his hand lowering from his gun. "You're done running." Elias nodded. "I'm done." The sheriff's jaw worked, like he was chewing the taste of mercy. After a long pause, he said quietly, "If I take you in, you'll hang." "Maybe I deserve to," Elias said. "But she doesn't deserve to live her life wondering what became of me." Clara stepped forward, eyes blazing. "No, you can't." But Elias turned to her, his hand finding hers. "Clara, you gave me peace. That's more than most men ever get." The last goodbye. The sheriff waited as Elias turned to her fully. The world seemed to slow around them, even the wind grew still. "Promise me something," Elias whispered. "Don't close your door to the next stranger who knocks." There's good left in this world, and maybe they'll need your kindness, too. Clara shook her head, tears streaming freely. I can't do this again. I can't lose you. He smiled, that soft, quiet smile she had come to love. You never had to find me to lose me. I've been lost for years. He pressed something into her palm, the silver pendant he'd worn around his neck since the night she found him. Keep it, he said. So you'll know I was real. Then he kissed her, slow, gentle, full of everything words couldn't hold. When they parted, he whispered, "Thank you for answering the door." And before she could speak, the sheriff stepped forward, placing the cuffs on Elias's wrists. The law took him away, down the road that led into the horizon, where the sun burned low and red like fire. Clara stood there long after the dust settled, the pendant clutched in her hand, her heart aching with the weight of what love had cost her. Epilogue. The letter that traveled. Weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail, sealed with the mark of the Arizona Territorial Office. Clara hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling. Greater than Mrs. Dawson. Elias Monroe died in his sleep 3 nights before his scheduled execution. Before he passed, he asked us to send you this. He said you'd understand. Inside was another folded sheet, written in Elias's rough hand. Greater than Clara. The stars look different from where I am, but I still see your light. Don't grieve for me, I found what I was looking for. A home, a heart, a reason to stop running. Maybe love isn't meant to save us. Maybe it's just meant to remind us we were worth saving once. Yours, always, Elias. Clara read the letter over and over until the ink blurred through her tears. That night, she walked outside, looked up at the desert sky, and whispered into the wind, "You found peace, Elias. So will I." And for the first time in years, she left her door open, just a crack, in case another lost soul ever came knocking at midnight.